All right, folks, a bunch of new cards once again today and some pretty exciting stuff.
Hey, buddy, watch this.
If you're short on time, hit the quick reviews link in the description to see the reveals and my ratings from 1 to 5 stars. Otherwise, let's jump into some detailed discussion. Up first here is the Neferset Ritualist, a new neutral minion, 2 mana, 2/3 with a battle cry, restore adjacent minions to full health. So pretty powerful card here if you got something that needs like 6 health. This is a big time heal for a 2 mana card, and I think we know some obvious synergies that exist for cards like this. You got things like Heal Druid, of course. Any kind of priest with a Northshire Cleric out there could typically utilize a card like this. We've also got the new mechanic Reborn, which is going to leave your minions at 1 health. So a deck that's really reliant on Reborn minions could potentially use the Ritualist as well, just to heal those back up to full, assuming they had enough health to really make it worth it. Going from 1 to 2 might not be great, but if there's like a 5 health Reborn minion, the Neverset Ritualist could make a really big heal. So there are certainly some ways to use this. Now that said, I don't really know if this card's going to be strong enough in Constructed. There are often just better ways to do things. You might just rather play a big scary thing instead of just trying to heal up cards that have already been played. Not all decks can take favorable value trades and get that heal value instantly, or use some extra way to synergize with their heals. And even things like Heal Druid, healing face is a more reliable target often than just trying to hit minions that may or may not have taken damage, leaving this card a little bit stranded in your hand. So I think this is okay in Constructed, pretty darn good in Arena. A lot of times in Arena you have those minions left, and minion heals can be amazing. But in Constructed, it's probably only going to ever make sense in like 1 or 2 decks, and they will likely have other ways to heal things that could just be more consistent, faster, bigger, whatever it is, targeted in some ways, often just more flexible too. So I'd say it gets left at the wayside a little bit here in Constructed, but certainly not a fundamentally bad card by any means. All right, now let's take a look at the Wasteland Assassin, a new 5 mana 4/2 with Stealth and Reborn revealed by my boy Dexter, and it is a card. I don't actually think it's a particularly good card, I'm sad to say. So first things first, right, a 4/2 for 5 is unfortunately a little bit of a weak stat line. 2 health just doesn't go very far. Now this does have somewhat of a piloted shredder feel to it, where it's like you get this 4 attack minion. It's got a death rattle effect in the essence of a Reborn that's going to come back as a 4/1 stealth. So you do get 2 bodies. They are both relatively difficult to deal with, so presumably you can take some value trades on board, like trade in the 4/2 and then it dies. Your opponent maybe can't answer the 4/1 because it's also going to have stealth. It's being added to the board with stealth, which means they can't really deal with the 4/1, maybe get a second value trade. That's perhaps the best case scenario for this card. The challenges there are the fact that turn 5 plus 4 attack isn't quite as good as you'd hope for, like, turn 3 or turn 4. It's going to be harder to take those value trades. 1 health is still honestly rather susceptible to all kinds of things like warpaths and whirlwind effects out there. So even that's a little bit risky. And then also, it's just, is that enough for a 5 mana card? Are taking trades like that a good play for most decks? And to me, probably not. There are better ways to take favorable trades. Just taking trades instantly is good. This is sitting there for a turn doing nothing because it doesn't have rush. So it's really not even maybe attacking until turn 6 in some cases. You're just kind of playing out a card here that's not reacting immediately. It's not doing much. It's sticky, but it's a little late in the game to be sticky like that. It's not much inherently better than like a piloted shredder, but it's a mana slower. So unless you can utilize this stealth in some super creative way, like with buffs on board in like a deck that's trying to go face, maybe doing some aggressive damage so your opponent can't really deal with it, and you're just hoping to stick any minion, then you drop like, I don't know, Blessing of Kings plus Blessed Champion or something to do, 16 damage. There are possibilities there because this is one of the stickier stealth minions that we've ever had. So I like that there are some ways for this thing to actually get played. I don't think those ways will be consistent or good, or that most decks will be able to utilize those very effectively, but it's not hopeless, right? It's not just a totally wasted card slot. I think there's a chance somebody figures out a way to make this okay at best, but I don't think this is a great card. I don't think most decks are going to utilize it. It's probably fine in something like Arena, but in Constructed, there are going to be better options for every deck and every class out there, or most every deck and most every class. So the Wasteland Assassin, unfortunately, falls a little short. Up next here, we have Pressure Plate from Hunter, a new secret that reads, after your opponent casts a spell, destroy a random enemy minion. So I think the idea here is like a direct counter to maybe Mountain Giant Conjurer's Calling stuff. After that Conjurer's goes off, you get to destroy one of those really big crazy threats that the mage has played. Or in any case, if your opponent has a big thing out there, you get to punish that big thing by killing it. But although I've seen some positive reactions to this card, I think it's going to be far more awkward than most people realize. Namely, people will know how this is triggered, and if you have a really big threat out there, you maybe don't have to play a spell. They'll be like, well, I mean, I'm only sitting on exactly a Mountain Giant. Why risk it with a spell right now? I could just do something else. I mean, maybe Conjurer's Mage could have a little bit of trouble with that, but many decks could just either play another minion or maybe just not do anything against a secret like this. So I think there's a lot of play around possibility with this one. Beyond that, as soon as your opponent plays a smaller thing, they can drop a 1 or 2 mana minion like a Mana Cyclone alongside their Mountain Giant, then your odds of this card hitting successfully become far, far weaker because it is just a random enemy minion. It's like a deadly shot that your opponent gets to dictate when it goes off. And although Deadly Shot's a fine card, if your opponent had the control to determine when a Deadly Shot was played, I think Deadly Shot would be way, way worse, right? Now, of course, any secret creates friction. It creates decision-making problems for your opponent where they have to maybe make suboptimal turns. So, yes, just the fact that it's a secret and it exists is important, and your opponent will have to think about it from time to time, particularly for like random secret generation stuff. So I like that the card's in the game. I just don't know if it'll actually be good enough to make the cut compared to other secrets in any kind of secret hunter build. They can run quite a wide gamut of secrets, but often they narrow it down to the most important ones and even sometimes run 2 of those secrets instead. I'm not sure Pressure Plate will make that cut. I think the unreliability of it, its weakness against things like aggro decks that, first off, maybe just don't really play that many spells, but also even when you hit the minions, you're not necessarily getting much of an upside. You'll just kill a random wacky or something. There are some really big downsides to this card, and I have the feeling other options will just be better for Hunter when they're picking certain cards to address a meta. I don't think Pressure Plate even gets there. So it's a totally fine card. In certain metas, it would thrive more than in others. But I think it has a lot more downsides than many people are recognizing, and often it's just going to kind of whiff, and you'll regret spending 2 mana on it. Moving on to Into the Fray, we have first of a handful of, taunt warrior synergy stuff here. This is a new 1 mana spell that gives all taunt minions in your hand +2/+2. So we already in the past saw our Megadillo, the big legendary minion for warrior that's also a taunt hand buff card. This is a spell that's very similar, but very cheap. And we're going to see some new taunt minions introduced in this video as well. So clearly a taunt warrior package is coming together. Now, I liked the Armagadillo a lot more. Armagadillo, I think I'm saying that without a syllable there. Armagadillo a lot more than I like Into the Fray. Because it's attached to a big minion, it doesn't feel as bad to draw or to play. There's something substantial and meaty to that card inherently. Into the Fray, I don't know if it feels quite as good. It may not pack quite as much punch for a single card draw, but nonetheless, if you are building your deck full of taunts and you can hit 3 or 4 taunts with this is a pretty big buff for only 1 mana in a deck that maybe doesn't have anything to do on the first few turns anyway. So this might just be a nice, cheap, easy way to start the game and get things rolling. We'll also see some ways to add taunt minions to your hand. So you might even hit more than 4 or 5 taunts if you can build this deck in the right way. Maybe hit like 6, 7, 8 taunts. And then a card like this has some really big dividends being paid. So it's got potential. We saw Smugglers run a card that was also a 1 mana hand buff spell, and it was okay. Hand buff Paladin never really got over the hump, but I have seen people playing that in Wild, and I felt like it was an okay package when you tried to build a mediocre hand buff Paladin deck. This one feels pretty similar, but the buff is bigger, but it only hits select targets. But if your deck is built with only those select targets in mind, it's kind of the same thing as Smugglers run if you're just all taunts regardless, but then twice as effective from the stat buff standpoint. So It does look like it potentially has higher synergy and therefore maybe higher output than Smuggler's Run would have had, so it's comparably favorable to that card. Still not sure it gets all the way there. Taunt Warrior's got a lot to compete with Mech Warrior. Like, how is this deck going to be better than Mechs? I have some questions about that, but it's possible that once Mechs rotate out and this hangs around in a standard format rotation, a card like this helps empower a new Taunt Warrior deck. So speaking of taunt cards for Warrior, let's take a look at the Frightened Flunky, a new 2-mana 2/2 with Taunt and Battlecry. Discover a Taunt minion. So this is a cheap little Stonehill Defender for Warrior. And we all know Stonehill Defender was really one of the best cards in Hearthstone for a long time. Played in so many different decks because it turns out getting a nice little stall body that generates you more stuff and can even turn into itself is a pretty powerful tool. And I think Frightened Flunky will meet many of the same positives that Stonehill Defender did. I will say I think the 2/2 body is materially worse than the 1/4. The health total is typically what matters on these taunts, just being able to stall it out. So although this is a little bit cheaper, if it was like a 1/3 or a 2/3, obviously that would be substantially better. But nonetheless, I think a 2/2 still serves the purpose of being that little interruption. And more importantly, perhaps, is the fact that Frightened Flunky will itself be going into the taunt pool as a warrior card. And with Discover effects, class cards are weighted extra heavily compared to neutral cards. So you're actually going to be really likely to find another Frightened Flunky or an Armadillo. So some of the new big taunts in Warrior are going to be there to add extra consistency to the Discover pool from this minion. So it's not crazy to think that you could get a Frightened Flunky into a Frightened Flunky, into a Frightened Flunky, into a Frightened Flunky, into a Frightened Flunky. Not likely, but it's possible. You could just spend all 10 mana playing 5 minions and getting 5 additional taunt minions in your hand. And of course, when you're playing hand buff cards like our previous one or the Armadillo, then suddenly having all those taunts in hand is fantastic. So this card is pretty much the perfect synergy tool for a taunt hand buff warrior deck. And I think it's probably good even beyond that too. If you're not running taunt synergies, it's just like a Stonehill Defender. So in a lot of ways, this card to me looks fantastic. I think it hits a lot of precedents that we know are good, and it perhaps makes them even better because it is itself in its own taunt pool. So Frightened Flunky, hilariously enough for the artwork choice here, pretty obviously Shaggy from Scooby-Doo, is a good, maybe even stupendously good card. So next up here we have the Infested Goblin, this time a neutral taunt minion. It's a 3-mana 2/3 with a Death Rattle, add 2 1/1 Scarabs with taunt to your hand. So another way to get extra taunt minions into your deck, or into your hand, excuse me, which is, again, all about buffing them, and you can turn those 1/1 Scarabs into 3/3s or 5/5s pretty easily with some of the cards we've already seen in Warrior. So this is another synergy piece potentially. Now, I will say a 2/3 taunt at a base is not very good. That's worse than our good friend the Iron Fur Grizzly, arguably worse than Silverback Patriarch in some ways at a base. But if you can utilize this Death Rattle successfully, that's pretty cool. There are also some implications in like a token deck. We've seen Acorn Bearer as a front half that gives you 2 1/1s in your hand. That's a pretty powerful play, but I don't think many token decks, and Druid in particular, would ever run this over Acorn Bearer. And I think there are probably better 3-mana options just to instantly load up the board as opposed to have this delayed loading of the board. You got to spend more mana. It's like 5 mana to get all this stuff out. That's where this card really falls short, and I don't even know if this would be worth it in the hand buff taunt warrior deck. You might just have better taunts that you'd rather run instead of trying to kind of separate these resources out into multiple parts, because half the time this would end up hitting the buffs instead of your 1/1 Scarabs. So it feels to me like this one is just a tad too awkward and takes a little bit too much mana to actually get everything into play. A 2/3 with 2 1/1 taunts is probably not the best 5-mana play. I think I'd just rather run an Iron Fur Grizzly, frankly, just to make sure I get the most influence as possible on the front half of this body. So Infested Goblin, despite making some sense with what we've been talking about in this video so far, I think the card itself just feels a little too awkward, a little too piecemeal, and that's why it's probably not going to make the cut, even in a deck it's sort of designed for. So moving on here, let's talk about the Diseased Vulture for Warlock. That is not a fledgling, sadly, but it's a 4-mana 3/5 beast, and it reads, after your hero takes damage on your turn, summon a random 3-cost minion. So potentially very powerful token generator here. We've seen some other minions like this, like Violet Teacher, that only summon 1/1s, but this is going to summon you 3-drops, which on average are probably about 3/3 in stat lines, and occasionally can high roll into even bigger, scarier stuff. So yes, if you can take damage on your turn with this card out, you're going to be getting some great results. Think about cards like Flame Imp. Suddenly you play a Flame Imp, and not only do you get the 3/2, but you also get like a 3/3, an Iron Fur Grizzly alongside it. That's pretty incredible. And I don't know how on earth we've talked about Iron Fur Grizzly so much in this video. Here we are again. So you play a Crystallogist, and it's like, boom, I get a 3-drop too. I can see a self-damage Warlock doing a lot of work with a card like this, and frankly, those styles of Warlock are already being played a little bit, both from like the Heal Zoo days, but there's even some builds right now out there as well, and we have some other synergy cards for this style of play that haven't really been utilized just yet. And as a 4-mana 3/5, I think this card's okay to just play out. We've seen Violet Teacher's work, we've seen Thunderhead work. Whether you do it in the same turn with like a 1-drop on turn 5, or you just kind of play it out and expect it to live, there's probably a lot of upside bundled into this. And then, of course, you always have your hero power. You don't need other cards too, so just tap that hero power button, draw a card, and summon a 3/3. That's a pretty powerful play. If this lives for a turn or two, you're going to generate a ton of onboard value through it. And even if it doesn't do anything right away, it's not the worst 4-mana play. It's not like, you know, a Mountain Giant. It's not super exciting, but it's probably something you're willing to take a risk on just for that possible upside over multiple turns. And Zoo decks could utilize that really nicely as that mid-game power option. They sometimes lack on that turn 4, turn 5 these days. A card like this could fill in that gap really nicely and give Zoo some pretty cool stuff to do. The one downside for a card like this is it's like naturally after the Magic Carpet turn on turn 3, and if you're building a deck around Magic Carpet, you typically wouldn't want to spend a turn 4 building into a diseased Vulture, so there might be some downsides there, but this is almost a turn 6 card at its base if you think about it, because the hero power or having some kind of synergy, so it builds a little gap in even between that Magic Carpet to make it feel fine, because you don't always play it on 4, 5 or 6 might be better anyway. So yeah, I see a lot of ways to make this card work, not a lot of downsides, and some pretty big upsides means this is a card with tons of potential. And then finally here we have the Anubisath Warbringer, a new neutral 9-mana 9/6 with a death rattle. Give all minions in your hand +3/+3. So a hand buff card here, and as we know, a hand buff has not been the best mechanic in Hearthstone's history. That's going to be a struggle for this card right off the bat, and there are a handful of problems. It's also 9 mana. Typically, if you're going to be doing hand buff stuff, you'd rather do it earlier than later so you get to utilize those hand buffs as soon as possible. But this is coming down super late in the game as a 9 mana card. It's also on a death rattle, so it's not even happening immediately, therefore it's susceptible to all kinds of silence, transform effects. It may just not die right away, so there could be a natural delay. And then even the stat line on this is not great for a 9 mana card. So 5 or 6 hurdles right off the bat for this thing that make it incredibly slow, awkward, hard to use at a base level. This card stinks. It's awful, it's slow. It just doesn't work as a 9 mana play. No deck in the right mind, I think, would run this as a 9 mana card. But we have already seen the card Anka the Buried for Rogue, the new legendary that will reduce Death Rattle minions down to 1 mana 1/1s. And there is a small world, I think it's still very unlikely, where Anubisath Warbringer is worth it in a deck that can run Anka the Buried to make a nice little 1 mana 1/1 with a pretty big hand buff effect. But to be honest with you, I'm not even totally sure a 1 mana 1/1 with a death rattle that gave +3/+3 to minions in your hand would be a great card in its own right, just because hand buff has been pretty unreliable. We like some hand buff stuff for Warrior because it's building a really specific package, so I'm not giving up hope, obviously. Maybe an Anka the Buried deck would run this successfully, but even that happens after turn 5 because you got to play your Anka first. So even that's pretty slow for a hand buff to hit. And as I always say with hand buff cards like this one, it takes a long time to get this buff realized. So you spend like some amount of mana on your Warbringer, either 1 or 9. The buff hits, then you got to spend mana on the first minion. You got to spend mana on the second minion. So if all your minions averaged like 5 mana, for instance, and you had 5 of them in hand, you'd have to spend another 25 mana before you saw all of these +3/+3 buffs actually influence the board. and that's a bit of a struggle, right? The same thing could be said about our hand buff warrior cards previously, certainly, but those you're going to be building into taunt minions, right? And taunt minions have a way to impact the board more immediately, so those stats get put into play a little faster. Now, obviously, you could run taunts with the Anubis Warbringer as well. That's a possibility, but I don't think Rogue could do that nearly as easily with an Anka deck, and I don't think anybody else can afford to run this card at 9 mana, so there aren't as many avenues for this thing to find some world where it sees play. Therefore, I think this card's really, really bad. It's not a 1-star card because it does have that possible angle in Rogue, but it sure is close. I think it's just so disastrously slow. And there you go, that wraps it up for our detailed reviews. Now let's jump into some quick reviews. Set Ritualist is a 3-star card. Wasteland Assassin is a 2-star card. Pressure Plate is a 2-star card. Into the Fray is a 3-star card. Frightened Flunky is a 5-star card. Infested Goblin is a 2-star card. Diseased Vulture is a 4-star card. Anubisath Warbringer is a 2-star card. And there you go, guys. Let me know what you think of these scores. That's right, I did give a 5-star rating to the Frightened Flunky. I think it's really good in the deck it's made for, and I think it's really good outside of that. Stonehill Defender has set some very powerful precedents for a card like that, and in some ways I think it's a little weaker, but in other ways I think it might even be better. So yeah, I think it's possible that one hits the 5-star mark. What do you guys think out there? Share your thoughts in the comments below, but until then, thanks much for watching, and until next time, game on.